So my name's David Cantor and I'm a lecturer at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, where I'm also the director of the Refugee Law Initiative. Now, the Refugee Law Initiative is a centre that works to promote research collaborations between academics, but also research collaborations between academics and practitioners, so that could include policymakers. The Refugee Law Initiative started very, very modestly a few years ago with a single seminar series that was organised between the institution where I do my teaching, which is the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, which is also part of the School of Advanced Study, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And over the course of a year, that year being the 60th anniversary of UNHCR and of the Refugee Convention, we ran a seminar series with 8 academics to commemorate that 60th anniversary. So these academics came along, presented their work, a group of people built up around this seminar series, both academics and practitioners, and by academics I include students, who were interested in refugee law issues. And it was really on the back of that that the suggestion was made, well, why don't we make this a more permanent fixture? Yes, of course, we could run lots of one-off seminars, but why not create a kind of small centre where these things could have an institutional home? And the Refugee Law Initiative started, we were lucky to get a very small grant to fund a part-time position for a research coordinator, who at that time was Margherita Blandini, who did a good bit of the work involved in the logistics of, calling people up saying, when are you free to come and give a talk? When is there a room to be booked? And we developed a number of projects out of that. I think that we're fortunate in that we've had a lot of, a lot of moral and logistical support from people in the field, so academics in London and beyond, or practitioners working in UNHCR, who've been extremely generous with their time and advice and have participated in the things that we're doing, and I think now see us, or are beginning to see us, as a resource that they can use for some of their own work, to broadcast it to a wider audience, or perhaps even to run a seminar through our system. I worked for a good number of years as a practitioner in the refugee law field, and then of course, having done a PhD and worked in academia, I've got a fairly extensive network of contacts, and without that I don't think it would have been possible to really get the thing off the ground. But at the same point we also approached people who we just identified blindly, as it were, who we didn't have a pre-existing personal connection with, but were kind enough to accept, as it were, a cold call, or a cold call by email saying, look, this is what we're doing. Would it be possible to speak to you for 20 minutes by telephone, just let you know what we're about, and whether there are ways that you might be interested in participating, or any feedback that you might have for us. So taking advantage of any opportunity that presents itself, I think, is important, but it would have been very difficult had we not had those pre-existing networks to draw on. Who are the practitioners that we've been able to reach in the last year? Well, a good number of them are, of course, solicitors and barristers and other legal practitioners working in the asylum or human rights field in the UK. And they bring a variety of really interesting perspectives to the kind of events that we do. And they're always sparking off ideas. You go along and you hear somebody stand up and make a point, and you think, look, there's a good research project in that, or that's not an area that's been looked at a great deal. I wonder whether this person might be interested in developing something around that, or developing something in their own work which others might be able to draw on. We also, I suppose, reach a much wider audience of UN staff, like the UNHCR, humanitarian practitioners, and others who are working in the humanitarian field overseas. And again, we've been very lucky to be able to collaborate with them on various projects. And in fact, one of my own research projects, which was recently funded by the ESRC, a 3-year project which starts next month, looking at new dynamics of forced migration in Latin America, actually came out of some work that was funded by UNHCR on a very different issue in Latin America. So one sees that there's always these kind of stepping stones when one works with practitioners. And of course practitioners are really working at the coalface, and they're attuned to the new developments, and that's not something one can get by simply being an academic. I think in our field of law one has to have that very strong connection with what's going on in practice, be it practice in the courts, or that form of legal practice, or humanitarian practice more widely. I suppose the third kind of practitioner that we've become involved with has been government officials, and earlier this year we ran a special training workshop for the heads of refugee service of 15 southern Commonwealth governments. And hearing their perspectives on refugee protection was something absolutely, we were providing some training on some of the law and some of the policy, but hearing their perspectives and their ideas around this area was really something that for me as an academic was absolutely fascinating. And I know that the other academics who were involved in the training really got a great deal out of it, and that's a network that we're constantly trying to keep invigorated and live. So keeping these connections going is hard work often, but it's very, very rewarding, at least from our side, and I hope for the practitioners also. In terms of, I suppose, more practical impact, if the division isn't too artificial, then we've also, through that same process, collected instances, and also through talking to people who've participated in these events, collected instances where our work has had a practical impact. And when I say our work is simply facilitating that, say, an academic paper reaches or is presented to people in policy or practice. And I can think of a number of different issues where we've had academics presenting, say, on a new legal development or where the law should or might go. And policymakers have been in the audience, and they've taken that on board and reflected it in a policy paper. Or a barrister or solicitor's been sitting in the audience, and they've taken some of those ideas and run with them the next time they've had a case on that particular issue. In terms of wider practical impact, I can refer obviously to this training workshop that we had for Commonwealth governments earlier in the year, and the impact there has, I think, been quite positive. To give you an example, we've had various of these governments coming back privately to us and asking for legal advice on particularly difficult issues. And these are issues that are, in a sense, quite high profile. They involve relations between states. They involve intense humanitarian concerns. And we've been in a position, having made these connections and having, I think, demonstrated through the workshop that academia and academic refugee lawyers can contribute something to practice. We've been in a position where they've trusted us to come back and ask for our legal advice on these sorts of issues. So these are, in a year, this is not a bad set of practical impact. The field that we work in, I think it's difficult for a PhD student not to have anything to do with practitioners. If you're working on refugee law issues or humanitarian law issues, then it's very difficult to do so in a bubble. You pretty much have to be, asking maybe, say, UNHCR for access to their archives, or talking to people in the field or whatever it is in order to get the data you need to do your PhD. And I think that that's a good way of building up the connections if you want to be influencing practice or policy after you finish your PhD. I don't think that you can start quickly enough. My own case is probably not a great one to go by. For most of my PhD, I was working in one full-time or part-time, either as a refugee lawyer or doing teaching or one thing or another. So my spare time, as it were, was dedicated to my PhD. If you're interested in being involved in influencing policy, then my strong suggestion to PhD students is, as soon as you've finished your PhD, try and find a way in which you can take your research to people who it's going to be useful to. In my own case, I was doing research on returns of displaced persons to their homes in the middle of armed conflict in Colombia. And I was fortunate to get funding from the ESRC in the year after I finished my doctoral thesis to go to Colombia and disseminate those findings on the ground. And so I was able to take those findings to displaced communities who might be considering return or who have returned, and my research was able to give them some insight into ways of ensuring greater security in the midst of armed conflict. I was able to disseminate it amongst international agencies working in Colombia, NGOs working in Colombia, and affect their kind of internal policies and practices around return. And also I was fortunate to be able to disseminate it to the government itself, the government of Colombia, and to feed into its policies on the protection of displaced persons. All of these things are somewhat open to luck, but whilst I was in Colombia, they drafted a new law on the protection of, or on the reparation of victims, and I was able to use my research as a way of going into Congress and trying to convince Congress to provide greater protection to displaced persons in certain areas of that law, and was successful in doing that. But it was a long process of interaction with the Colombian Congress, with the ministries there, and with other experts who were working on that theme. So having those sorts of schemes available is very useful if you've got PhD research which you can then take and share with the people who are going to be able to actually perhaps implement some of your recommendations or take advantage of some of the knowledge that you've produced through your PhD.